Welcome to WebRTC Live. In WebRTC Live, we cover the latest technical topics and business use cases for WebRTC and live video. As always, this episode is brought to you by WebRTC.Ventures, leading integrators of WebRTC video into your custom application.
Welcome back to WebRTC Live. I'm your host, Arin, founder and CEO at WebRTC.Ventures. WebRTC.Ventures is a custom design and development firm specializing in building live video applications. We're here to help you take your video application live. You can learn more about us at WebRTC.Ventures. For today's episode of WebRTC Live, I'd like to welcome Natalie Silvanovich from Google to join us. She is talking with us today about WebRTC security. She is a security researcher on Google's Project Zero. Natalie's current focus is browser security, including script engines, WebAssembly, and WebRTC. Previously, she worked in mobile security on the Android security team at Google and as a team lead of the security research group at BlackBerry, where her work included finding security issues in mobile software and improving the security of mobile platforms. So thanks a lot for joining us today, Natalie.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yes, to have you here. So go ahead, and Natalie's going to share with us more about how to secure WebRTC applications, and should definitely welcome your questions. So if you have the questions anytime throughout this, feel free to just put them in the chat for us.
Yeah, definitely feel free to just ask anything at any time. So today I'm going to talk about how to secure your WebRTC application. I'm Natalie Silvanovich, and I'm on a team called Project Zero at Google. We're a team that aims to reduce the impact of zero-day vulnerabilities in the wild. And we do this from a user-focused perspective. So we look at all products, not just Google products. And the bulk of our work consists of finding zero-day vulnerabilities so that they can be fixed by the vendor and are no longer available to attackers. But we also spend a lot of time watching what attackers are doing in the wild. And there's been a few incidents involving RTC software recently. Last year, there was a zero-day vulnerability detected in WhatsApp. And this was used by totalitarian governments to attack activists and academics and others. And the way this worked is it actually used their RTC system, their video conferencing, and the attacker would call WhatsApp and then start a peer-to-peer connection and use memory corruption in that connection to get code execution and steal someone's WhatsApp data. Someone has their hand raised. Not sure what to do about that.
James, if you want to just type your question in the chat, we'll definitely bring it up. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. And then there was another incident, and this involved group FaceTime. And basically, a number of people, including a few middle schoolers, found a vulnerability in FaceTime where using your phone, if you started a group call and then you added yourself, it would connect that group call even though the person hadn't answered the call. So this was a very different vulnerability. This wasn't, a targeted group of highly skilled attacker going against high value targets. This was something that was, available to anyone. Everyone, including middle schoolers, could now spy on their friends. And this ended up being a substantial downtime incident as well. As soon as Apple found out about this bug, they had to take down group FaceTime, and it was down for a couple of days before they fixed it. Today I want to talk about how you can avoid this from happening to your application. How do you prevent this type of problem for your users? So I'm going to start off by talking about the different types of vulnerabilities that can affect RTC systems. And then I'm going to give some examples of vulnerabilities that I found and how they happened. And finally, I'm going to talk about how you prevent these types of bugs. So to start off, there's a lot of different types of ways to use WebRTC. Yeah, semi-slipstream. Let me quickly click that link. I don't know a ton about it. Yeah, I think this was a vulnerability that allowed basically likely to use this sort of thing to basically bypass the network restrictions that are on a network. I'm actually not going to talk about this type of vulnerability, but it is something that I think you definitely do need to be concerned about with WebRTC. But also, not to take away from Sammy's work, I do feel that there's a lot of focus on this type of vulnerability, which does have some consequences. But then there's also some what I think are even worse problems where, instead of being on a network endpoint and being able to launch an attack, you can actually take over someone's device and, get all the data on it. And I think these are all important, but I do think that I've seen a lot of attention given to this type of network proximity attack. Well, people don't give a similar attention to the type of vulnerabilities that I'm looking at. So to get back to, how do people use WebRTC? There's a lot of different ways. I think the ones that are most prone to attacks are mobile applications. There's actually a fair amount of evidence that attackers attack mobile applications, and partly is because they tend to be connected all the time. If someone is on WhatsApp or FaceTime or Signal or anything like that, they're connected all the time. And if you can call them and you can launch an attack, that's problematic. And I also want to mention WhatsApp and FaceTime do not use WebRTC. They use alternatives, but regardless of whether you use libWebRTC or another library, the types of problems you have are pretty much the same. So also there's web applications, and I would put this kind of in like a lower tier of attack. Yes, they also get attacked by attackers, but there's less risk because, you have to manually choose to enter a call. It's not like someone can call you on, for example, Zoom unless you've chosen to enter that call. But there still are a lot of bugs, for example, where people are entering calls they're not supposed to. There's also a lot of innovative uses of WebRTC for things like projection and streaming, making your tiny phone screen project to your TV, that sort of thing. And these tend to be lower risk because the user controls both endpoints and can make decisions about it. So one class of vulnerabilities we see is memory corruption vulnerabilities. And the general idea here is in WebRTC, you have this peer-to-peer connection. And if one peer can cause another peer to have memory corruption, as a rule of thumb, it can execute code on that peer. And typically this will allow an attacker to be able to access any data that WebRTC can access. So often that'll be like your messages, your files, definitely every conversation you're having over WebRTC. And also it's not unusual for attackers to chain multiple vulnerabilities. So they'll use this WebRTC one and then find one in an Android subsystem and, get access to your entire system that way. And in WebRTC, these sorts of bugs are fairly common. I would say maybe one is fixed every month. And this is not specific to WebRTC. This is the nature of the protocols in WebRTC being so complex. It's hard to implement them without errors. So here's an example of a vulnerability that I was able to exploit. And the green is how the bug was fixed. So this was in user SCTP, and basically it's a use after free vulnerability. You would have this error, and then instead of returning, it would just free this ACK packet and move on. This ended up being an interesting vulnerability because it actually sent that packet, so you could use this to read the memory of the other device because it would send back this freed ACK. But I was also able to use it to get code execution. And I picked this example also because, look at how small the fix is to make it not a bug anymore. I mean, who among us have never made a coding error like this one? So I've got another question here. How to prevent a user that injects malicious code on camera request in WebRTC? So I'm not quite sure what that means. maybe you can describe the attack scenario more. Is it that there is malicious code on the camera, or I'm not quite sure what you mean there.
I was assuming that I'm guessing if Hugo's talking about in the browser there, is there a concern that you could inject malicious code when the browser requests access to the camera microphone in a normal get devices in a normal WebRTC call setup? Or does the browser, the fact that you're in that browser sandbox, eliminate that sort of concern?
Yeah, so that's a complicated question. I would say generally the risk of using WebRTC in a browser is less than if you're a native integrator. And I can't think of an easy way that would happen. That said, web applications do have bugs, so it is possible that a bug like that could happen. But I don't think there's anything specific to WebRTC that can also just happen on every web page. So this next question, you said there are many bugs as WebRTC is complex. Is it because of all the protocols not that well tested and not all code paths are tested? Yeah, that's basically exactly it. If you're a security researcher and you're trying to find every bug in a piece of software like Chrome is, you have to make sure that you're exercising every code path, either through automated testing or through manual testing. And that's really hard when there is a really large amount of code. So yeah, these typically occur in code paths that aren't well tested. And also because of the statefulness of WebRTC, things that haven't been tested, in that order, that sort of thing. So this is a video of a remote exploit. This is actually on Duo, and I wrote this as a sample. So this is just an example of, I have these two devices, and then I'm starting my Duo call, and you can see this terminal. That's basically just going through the exploit, and you'll see these things will slowly be sent to the target device, and then a calculator will pop up, and that's the sign that I've executed code on the target device. So this is just an example of what it would look like for an attacker. They can send you this special WebRTC call, and then often without user interaction, execute code on the target device. So this is largely a risk for mobile applications that integrate WebRTC. Also, this is very rare, but if you have a WebRTC application that is in C, not in Objective-C or Java, it's also possible that your code in the app is susceptible to memory corruption vulnerabilities. But this is uncommon. I think I've only seen one or two native applications that use mobile native applications that use WebRTC. It's more common to use Java or Objective-C. And this is something that you don't need to worry about in the browser. These bugs, of course, do affect browsers, but browsers will automatically update them so that the bugs aren't there anymore. And also, they just act like a normal browser vulnerability, of which there are many if you use them in the browser. So it's not like the attacker is going to get some special access by attacking a WebRTC application in a browser, as opposed to just getting the user to visit an untrusted page. So how do you protect yourself against this type of vulnerabilities? The big one is to reduce attack surface. So like Didi's question, there's a huge amount of attack surface code that an attacker can access through WebRTC that may or may not be well tested. So, the less of this that you can make available to an attacker, the less successful an attacker is going to be. So to do this, disable the unused codecs and features, and also make sure you really get rid of them. Because there were some apps that I looked at where, they tried to reduce the attack surface, but there was a way that I could turn the features back on. So the best thing to do is, if you're not using a codec, compile it out, or disable it through the pure connection factory. And that will mean if there's a bug in that, an attacker can't use it in your application. The other thing is make sure that you do as much as possible after the callee has answered the call. You saw in that example I showed you, the video, that the calc popped up without the user touching the device. But let's say, the app had not even started the WebRTC connection before the user picked up the phone. Obviously, they would have to pick up the phone for that exploit to work. So, the more you can do to make it so that the user has to answer the phone for an attack to work, the harder it is for an attacker. Because now, they have limitations. For example, the user has to be awake to answer the phone. Also, a lot of these vulnerabilities don't work on the first call. For example, that video I showed you required 2 calls. And if someone calls you and you pick it up and the application crashes, are you really gonna pick it up a second time and a third time? So this actually limits what an attacker can do with a vulnerability a lot if the user has to pick up the phone. So to explain this a bit more, so you're using WebRTC, you start off, you have your SDP offer, then you have your answer, and then you have your stun ice turn negotiation, and then you have your peer-to-peer connection. And then you start using things like codecs. Basically, every step you can require user interaction before it happens, the better. So that the most secure applications, and this tends to be, very, very high security messengers will not even send the offer until the person answers the call. And then, a lot of them will exchange the SDP, but not use it, or use it but make the connection inactive. And there's basically varying levels of activity you can have, and basically the less you have before the user picks up the call, the better. Other things you can do is limit who can start a call with a user. It's higher risk if, like WhatsApp, anyone can call anyone, because then that means that anyone can attack anyone. But for example, with something where you require a user to be like a friend with a user before they can call them, that means an attacker needs to do some work to, say, become a person's friend before they can attack them, and that limits them. Also, update WebRTC frequently. An attacker can't use a bug if that bug's been fixed. So make sure that you're updating your WebRTC binary every time there's a memory corruption bug. I would say this would be once every 1 or 2 months. Also, there are compiler flags that make vulnerabilities more difficult to exploit. These are on by default in WebRTC. So just when you're compiling, leave the compiler flags there. Don't mess with them. So there's another type of problem, which is logic vulnerabilities. If you think about you're using a WebRTC application, for example, even this webinar software, you're assuming that, it's not projecting your video before you press the button, people can't hear you while you're muted, that sort of thing. And there's been a lot of bugs that basically violate these expectations. And these are more serious than you think. Imagine you've got your computer or your phone in your living room. If people can just start listening to you, that's a pretty serious breach of trust. And this is something, unlike memory corruption bugs, that is not a bug in WebRTC per se. It's typically how it's integrated. And this can affect both web and mobile applications. So I'm going to give an example of a few that I've found. One kind of general area of logic vulnerabilities is like this one, which occurred in Signal. So basically, you're setting up your WebRTC connection. This is how it works normally. You send your offer, you get back your answer, you exchange your candidates, you start your P2P media. And then the way Signal works is then the user hits the button, and then it tells the caller that it's ready to start the call, and then they both turn on their cameras and you have a call. Yeah, sorry, I see the question about SFU. Can you tell me what SFU stands for in there? So here's how you could exploit this logic flow. You have the same setup. You've got your malicious caller, offer, answer, candidates, media stream. But then if the caller sent that message that's supposed to go from the callee to the caller to the callee, this would also cause the callee to pick up the call. So this is basically, you could just tell the other side to pick up the phone, and then you would get audio from that side. How to prevent this? One easy way is use different state numbers for caller and callee. This doesn't prevent you from needing to audit your code, but a lot of these bugs do happen just because, state 7 means something different if you're a caller and a callee and you get confused. So you might as well, make it 7 on a callee and 8 on a caller, and then you reduce the risk of that. Also make sure that you're always checking, when you're doing call state, is this a callee and caller? Because a lot of bugs happen from confusing that.
Natalie, before we go to the next example, just to expand on what I believe Hugo's asking there, SFU is referring to media server instead of doing a pure, as he's saying now in the chat, instead of doing a pure peer-to-peer WebRTC call, but using a media server in the middle for things like recording or handling different codecs or resolutions to different viewers. So the question there is, what if you're not doing a peer-to-peer, then what concerns are, I guess I would say, are there any different concerns maybe when you have a media server in the middle between those peers?
Basically it makes the attack scenario different. So on one hand, I think if you're like an attacker that wants to attack one other person, it makes things more challenging because these sorts of intermediary servers tend to terminate the WebRTC connection and start their own. So I remember when I was playing with that SCTP bug, right? I would send SCTP to these types of servers, and then they would terminate the connection, and then that bug would not get passed on to the peer. And what I didn't investigate, but what I'm sure is likely possible is, there could be a bug on the server though, and someone could compromise the server, and then you could basically send whatever you wanted to any peer. So I think it would be more challenging and probably kind of a higher level attacker that would do that sort of thing. But I do think that, if someone can compromise your intermediary server, that's very serious. So I think everything I said about memory corruption applies just as equally to anything you're using to decode RTP and other protocols on intermediary server.
Thank you.
So here's another vulnerability that I found, and this is in a messenger called GeoChat, though there were actually a couple that had this exact same problem. And this uses an intermediary server to send offers and answers, and actually so do all the other examples, but in this one what it does is actually kind of important. So you send the offer, and then the server transmits the offer. The callee sends the answer, it transmits the answer. But then they both send their SDP candidates, and instead of transparently passing them, the server will store these candidates for later. And then in a correct flow, the callee will accept, and then both sides will get their candidates. And then the P2P medium stream will start, and this will enable the call. And this is actually kind of a way to protect against memory corruption problems. That was what they were trying to do here. This means that you kind of have the maximum amount of stuff set up, and then you just do the minimum thing, which is starting the connection after the user has accepted a call. But this ended up having a bug in it itself. So the problem, of course, is that you can put candidates into an SDP offer. So you send this offer with candidates, you get the answer back, and then it starts the connection, and it enables the track in on ICE Connect. So this would just cause the call to completely pick up on the other side. So how do you avoid this sort of thing? One thing is, I would say, avoid kind of clever ways to prevent the security risk of setting up the connection before the call is answered, or if you do, test them well. But this was a situation where they had really good intentions. It's just, this idea didn't work out. I would also say avoid triggering security sensitive functionality on network events. This was part of their problem here, is they enabled the track, which is what starts sending video as soon as the network connection was complete. And I don't think they fully thought out, when can that network connection event occur. So if you do this, make sure you completely understand everything that can trigger that event. Also, design your applications with the assumption that attackers can alter SDP, because this and a few other bugs I found have also occurred because they assumed that the SDP sent by an application is the one that's generated by the application, but typically it's something that an attacker can just trivially alter. So this is another one. I won't say what app this vulnerability is in, because my team gives vendors a certain amount of time before we publish who the vendor is. But it was an interesting bug related to threading. So the way that this one works is the caller will send the SDP offer, and then this will trigger set local description, which calls onset success. And then what this one will do is it will call RTP sender set parameters and use that to disable the track so that it doesn't send video before the user has picked up the call. Then, it sends the answer, and then it exchanges candidates, does PDP media, and then when the user presses the button, it calls set parameters again to turn the track back on and make it transmit video. But what happened here is these were all actually in threads. So what you could do is, send the offer and the answer and candidate exchange would happen. And if you put stuff in there that made the connection very, very slow, and this was, I think the thing I actually used was basically just bombarding the SCTP connection with like so much data that it just like processing churned to a halt. Then this onset success and then the set parameters would get in the queue, but it would take a long time for it to get to the end of the queue. So it would basically start transmitting video for a few seconds, then eventually it would get disabled. But this was kind of an interesting threading error in how calls were picked up that led to, a few more photos than you would want your phone to transmit before you picked up a call. So how do you avoid this sort of thing? Be careful with concurrency and signaling. I would even say, this is kind of such a part of the call that doesn't really affect the user experience. Is it really necessary to do threading? Maybe the answer there is yes, but I'd encourage you to think that out because certainly once you're using concurrency, it becomes a lot more difficult to model what your call setup is doing and make sure it's safe. Also avoid relying on obscure features for security functionality. We were talking earlier about poorly tested features, and while it wasn't the specific problem here, that set parameters is actually kind of a lesser used feature. And I would encourage people, if you're using, to not use less used features for a call setup, just because, you don't know if they've been well tested, you don't know if they're going to change tomorrow, and you kind of like the better tested, more normal path you can use, the less likely you are to be affected by some sort of bug you're not expecting. Here's some other logic vulnerabilities you might also want to think about. Make sure your mute button really works. It's not just that the person on the other side's screen stops, processing audio, but the audio is really not being sent because, of course, someone can, write a custom client that processes the audio. Make sure that when you're doing a video conference that, the authentication works and random people can't enter random conferences. Make sure that everyone is notified when a P2P call becomes a group call. And make sure that video cannot be enabled in an audio call without user consent. So that's about it. So in conclusion, attackers are increasingly using WebRTC and other RTC libraries to harm users. Memory corruption vulnerabilities are a big part of this, and they're often reported in WebRTC and most libraries. So to reduce their impact, to start off, disable unused features in WebRTC. Make sure to start the peer-to-peer call after the after the call is answered, if at all possible, and update your WebRTC library often. Logic bugs are also a concern, and to avoid them, use different states for the caller and callee, like different numbers. Use tried and tested methods for setting up calls. Be careful for threading. And also make sure to evaluate your call setup from an attacker's perspective. Spend a day or two thinking, gee, if I'm an attacker and I want to force, the other side to pick up the call, how can I do this? And make sure there's nothing obvious. And finally, I just want to mention that I think that WebRTC integrators have a responsibility to protect their users. When you look at the sort of things that happen with these attacks, it's people being attacked by totalitarian governments. It's, people having their privacy invaded by people they know. It's the sort of thing that has real consequences for users. So it's easy to think about this in terms of, downtime or having to fix bugs. But I think it's also important to think about it in terms of protecting your users. So that's it. Thanks a lot. And I've got some more time for questions. And also, if you have a question you don't want to ask here, or if you don't think of it until later, feel free to email me or hit me up on Twitter.
Thank you so much, Natalie. Really appreciate it. Thank you to all our viewers for the excellent questions so far. If you have any others, please feel free to put them in the chat now. I have just a question or two, and then we'll close out in a minute. So Natalie, one thing I've heard you mention before is that a lot of vulnerabilities are not 100% effective, meaning like it may not happen every time before the callee answers the call, that you can inject malicious code to start the calculator like you showed, right? So it's not going to work every time. It might work 60% of the time, 70% of the time, whatever. How do you approach that from a testing perspective when, obviously you can't just test that idea once to see if this is a vulnerability that can occur?
So for that sort of thing, we typically use ASAN to basically add memory checks to libraries before we test them, and that will make these types of vulnerabilities happen every time. This is basically something you can compile with so that it's very slow, but every time you write to memory, it will check that that's valid. So if you test with something like that enabled on your library, even though it won't be exploited like an attacker would, it'll be evident that there's a failure in your application that you need to fix.
Yeah. And what about the trade-off between performance and security? I think it's interesting to consider that you might try and change some things about how you're connecting calls in order to reduce the connection time or improve performance, and potentially introduce a security vulnerability in that. And any best practices or anything you'd recommend around striking the right balance there?
Yeah, it's challenging, and I honestly don't feel like I can say what to do, because it really has to do with kind of like your users and what you're really willing to accept. But and I have noticed that different applications, make this decision differently. There's one in particular, very large application that doesn't set up very much. And literally when you pick up the call, they play an animation. So you don't perceive the time being as long. But then there's a lot of other ones that set it up in advance. And what I'd say is, if you can't do, if you're worried about performance, then that's a good time to think about alternatives. I know there was one application who's had a lot of problems with this, and, they never have made it so that the connection doesn't start before you pick up the call, but they did add things like now you have to, friend someone before they call you. And I think they finally made it so that, if you're not a friend, then, you get the slower use case. Right. So,
that makes sense.
To think about, if you can't.
That's really interesting. A couple different paths based on the level of trust that already exists between those users. We have a couple other questions here in the chat, and also a lot of praise for you as well for an excellent presentation and the work that you're doing. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
So a question here from Didi about what do you think about the WebRTC standard in general? And kind of a comment that is certainly not the first time I've heard this. You're not alone, Didi, that many of the examples or tutorials out there are outdated or maybe too simplistic. Any thoughts there, Natalie?
I would say that that is something that concerns me a lot. And I don't know how related it is to the standard, because I kind of got the impression, and I don't know if this is actually true, that kind of WebRTC was written and then the standard was written later. But I would say I'm very concerned about the state of documentation of WebRTC. And there's been a few situations where bad stuff has happened. For example, I always talk about when I started looking at WebRTC security, all that the website said was that it was completely secure. I also remember MDN for a long time had guidance that said like, oh, you should start the video stream as soon as possible for performance reasons. And it didn't mention like, gee, the user should have consented to send their video. So yeah, I would say that the state of documentation and tutorials is something I find very concerning. But I'm not sure what to do about it other than to try and fix it when I see it.
Yeah, it's not an easy thing to do, especially when over the years, so many things have changed. I'll give a plug here for in the last episode of WebRTC Live. Sean DeBois talked about WebRTC.ventures, which is basically a open source documentation project that he's doing partly out of these same concerns. So that may be something for the viewers to check out, contribute to, and hopefully becomes a more up-to-date over time. How about Timur asks, and this is similar to another question asked also, about different versions of libWebRTC. Are there different versions that have a different point of view on testing security, or maybe take a different approach to mitigating vulnerability risks? Is there any alternative like that out there, or do you think there should be?
Yeah, honestly, I haven't seen a version yet where I'm like, wow, this is the one that has like so many fewer errors than other ones. It seems like, I've really only looked at 3. So I've looked at WebRTC, I've looked at PJSIP, which is used by WhatsApp and a few other things, and I've looked at FaceTime's proprietary implementation. And yeah, I think the reality kind of with the performance push and the complexity of the protocols, they all have problems. And it'd be nice if there's kind of a secure alternative, but then, if no one uses it for performance reasons, that wouldn't be worthwhile. So I think like the problem is just the high level of performance that these applications require.
Yeah, absolutely. And Hugo asked a question I wanted to ask as well. Are there any particular tools that you recommend for testing security in these applications?
Yeah, I would say nothing offhand. What I would say is, my opinion is that there's no, especially for logic vulnerabilities, there's no substitute for just evaluating your code and making sure that you understand what's going on. I know for RTC libraries at Google, we do a ton of fuzzing on cluster fuzz. And if you're in a situation where you're writing your own RTP processing or anything in C, I would strongly recommend that you look into OSS fuzz for basically fuzzing that's integrated into your development setup.
Excellent. Yeah, and to add on to that a little bit, and also address another question in here about statistics and testing tools. A few other things viewers can check out. Hugo mentioned in the chat using TestRTC, which is a commercial tool for test automation around WebRTC applications. Definitely something to check out. There's also callstats.io, another commercial tool that can help you with around some of those stats on the performance of the application and help you understand any issues you're seeing in connectivity as well. And there's also the Kite project, an open source testing tool as well. So those might be a few things for you to Google and check out. All right. I think that concludes. Maybe just one other question here. Looks Timur asking about or commenting that Google did some nice work around gathering best practices on web performance, and just kind of it'd be nice to have something similar for WebRTC. So, Natalie, if you're aware of anything along that, feel free to give it a shout out.
Yeah. So that's not my area, but I'll pass that feedback on. And I also wanted to jump in with the similar question about WebRTC sandboxing. That is definitely something that exists in my dreams. If anyone wants to help make my dreams come true, I would love it.
That sounds great. All right, so if you have any other questions for Natalie, her contact information is here on the screen as well. Thank you all so much for joining us today, for your excellent questions. Natalie, thank you for an excellent presentation. We'll be posting this video to YouTube in a few days. And if you want to keep up with any of our future episodes of WebRTC Live, you can just follow us on Twitter at WebRTC.Ventures or join our email list at WebRTC.Ventures. Our next episode of WebRTC Live is scheduled for December 9th at 12:30 p.m. Eastern US. Armand Goldenstein from our team at WebRTC Ventures will be sharing tips on WebRTC debugging. So that'll be another really interesting one to check out. Don't miss it. You can register for that on the Big Marker page where you're watching this now, or keep up with it by following us at WebRTC Ventures on Twitter. Natalie, thanks again so much for joining us. Really enjoyed having you here. I hope you'll come back again in the future and give us some more updates on security around WebRTC.
Great. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. And thank you all for joining us. Let's make it live.
Thanks for joining us for WebRTC Live. Visit our website at WebRTC.Ventures to learn more about our custom design and development services, and to learn more about upcoming episodes of WebRTC Live.